This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. But not having as many ways to cheat things into play is a problem, although we'll see that, well, we'll look now, there are rares that help with that. Namely, Sneak Attack is another way to cheat things into play, but it's mythic. You can't really count on it. We have the Master of Ethereum here again, and Grand Architect, good artifact payoffs. There's also Tuk the Explorer, who I mostly have here because of how silly it will be to combo with Brutaclad, because the Golem token it gives you is huge, and turning all your mirror tokens into Golem tokens is pretty hilarious. So this is a good deck for it. So that's blue-red. It's kind of like a value reanimator kind of deck. It likes artifacts, obviously enough. It'll be interesting to see how this one exactly pans out, because I do think it's the hardest one to maybe nail down, you know, just looking at the sets and so forth. So next up, we're looking at black-red. So this is also an artifact deck, and it's a more aggressive artifact deck, and it's also one that has a sacrifice sub-theme, as black-red often does. So our Signpost Uncommon here is a very efficient removal spell that also damages the opponent if you have an artifact in play. And that's exactly the kind of thing that a more aggressive deck wants. A cheap removal spell like this that also goes after the opponent's life at the same time, that can result in huge amounts of damage in a single turn. You also have Falcon Wrath Aristocrat, who's not an artifact and doesn't care about artifacts, but it does give you ways to sacrifice things to give her indestructible. If it's a human, it gets even bigger. Fulminator Mage is another one of these signpost rares who's a little bit out there in the sense that it doesn't have anything to do with artifacts, and sure, it sacrifices itself, but it doesn't seem as on theme as the rest of this deck is. So let's look at the artifact payoffs for black-red. You'll note here that most of the artifact payoffs in this color pair are creatures, and that's one of the key things to keep in mind, and one of the reasons this deck is an aggro deck. So we have Oval Chase Daredevil, who I've talked about before as a card you can grind out value with by sacrificing it or whatever. But it's also an amazing attacker. You know, last time we saw this, you could just attack with this almost every turn, and your opponent had to be like, well, it's got 4 power, and sure, I can block it with my 3/3, but they're just going to get it back. And it just ends up hitting your opponent a lot as a result. We've got Painsmith, who makes one of your creatures a better attacker when an artifact enters the battlefield, or when you cast an artifact, rather. So, you know, giving something +2/+0 in Death Touch will make almost anything worth attacking with. Glaze Fiend loves it when artifacts enter the battlefield. It gains a stats boost every time that happens. Disciple of the Vault likes it when artifacts die, and this is probably the better deck for Disciple of the Vault, in the sense that this deck is going to be the one that can sort of rush the opponent and drop their life total rapidly, but maybe your opponent then manages to stabilize. And by playing something like Disciple of the Vault, your artifact creatures suddenly become a huge problem because your opponent can't block them or take damage from them, which probably means they lose. Defiant Salvager can cash in useless artifacts to become larger. We've already seen Koldatha Flame Fiend. It's a card that can let you just do 4 to your opponent or 4 to your opponent's board. It lets you sacrifice an artifact to do that. Orcish Vandal lets you sacrifice artifacts to do damage to them. Ravenous Intruder lets you sacrifice artifacts to become huge. And that's a key theme here. Cards in this color pair combine for a nice critical mass of creatures who get bigger when artifacts come down or when artifacts are sacrificed. Salivating Gremlins adds to that list anytime an artifact comes down against Trample and a stats boost. Thopter Engineer gives haste to all your artifacts, as we've seen, and gives you a 1/1. Haste is a nice aggressive stat. You do also have access to Trash for Treasure here and the black reanimation stuff we've already talked about, but finding a way to get those things into your graveyard is a lot harder here than it is in either red-blue or blue-black, which are the better decks at utilizing the reanimation stuff. There's Galvanic Blast, which has Metalcraft. Cranial Plating, you know, that's a very, very aggressive piece of equipment. Putting it on a Thopter token is pretty sweet. And you can actually move it at instant speed in this deck, so it is a potent piece of equipment to have. What kind of things do you want to sacrifice? Because a lot of these cards also sacrifice artifacts and other things and creatures. So we've already seen Driver of the Dead, and Oval Chase Daredevil is good at that, as well as Treasure Keeper, Cathodian. Something else to throw in the mix here that's interesting is Pyrite Spellbomb, which, if you can find ways to get it back, can be used repeatedly. Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot, a similar sort of effect. It's a nice thing to sacrifice because it gives you value no matter what. Clone Shell can actually let you cheat something into play. So it is something that can be mentioned in the context of the cheat into play decks, and it works here as well. Flayer Husk gives you both an equipment and a creature to sacrifice. Rapacious Dragon gives you a body and 2 treasures to sacrifice. What rares are well suited here? Well, we've got Bosch, who this is probably the best deck for him in the sense that you'll have access to red mana and lots of artifacts. Tuk Tuk's here again because sacrificing him gives you a better creature, and Disciple of Bolas lets you sacrifice something and get a bunch of value out of it. Alright, our next color pair is black-white, and this is kind of the one that I got to preview with my preview cards, which were Hidden Stockpile and Vishkal Blood Arbiter, which was pretty cool. And this is another one, I mean, I think it's much more well-defined, perhaps, than the blue-red one. It's about sacrificing for sure, but it's also good at bringing artifacts back in various ways or getting value out of them. Your signposts here, you've got the Hidden Stockpile. So Hidden Stockpile gives you value when one of your permanents leaves the battlefield during your turn. Dying is the easiest way to make this happen, especially because it has an activated ability that lets you sacrifice a creature. But leaving the battlefield in any way, bounce to your hand, whatever, blinked, that works too. That will give you a 1/1 servo. And then you can sacrifice creatures to scry. So sort of on its own, it's frequently going to at least sort of create an endless loop of you getting to sack a creature and scry 1 every turn because it will reload that servo. Vishkal, meanwhile, doesn't sacrifice artifacts, but he does sacrifice creatures and become huge. And there's also Thopter Foundry, which lets you give up non-token artifacts to make a blue Thopter artifact creature token with flying. And you'll note that this can be played in blue-white as well, a color pair we haven't looked at, and black-blue, a color pair we have. And it's also worth knowing that Sword of the Meek is in this set, and it's not at rare, so you can combine Thopter Foundry and Sword of the Meek to pull off a combo that's powerful enough for Modern, and that is a cool thing. And this is probably going to be the best deck for you to really abuse Thopter Foundry, so that will be something that you do sometimes. So what are the artifact payoffs here? How do they line up? Well, we have all our black ones again. So we've got Oval Chase Daredevil, which likes the graveyard and likes being sacrificed. You've got Painsmith, which is a more aggressive one. Same thing with Glaze Fiend. Disciple of the Vault, who likes it when artifacts die. Defiant Salvager, which kills artifacts for you. So, you know, there is a little bit of aggression here, but Painsmith and Glaze Fiend probably normally going to be at their best in other decks as opposed to this one. So keep that in mind, whereas the Daredevil, Disciple, and Defiant Salvager might be at their best here. You've got Auriok Salvagers, a white artifact payoff that lets you return cheap artifacts from your graveyard. There are some fun ones to combo with this. Pyrite Spellbomb being one example. Even if you can just draw a card with it every time, that's still pretty good. If you're splashing red and you can turn it into shock, that's great too. There's also one of the baubles in this set. There are things that you can do every turn with Auriok Salvagers to get value out of cheap artifacts in your graveyard, and that's pretty sweet. Mirrorsmith lets you make creature tokens when you cast an artifact spell if you pay 1 mana. Remember the Fallen is at its best here, because this is the Artifactiest white deck, really. And it lets you return both a creature and an artifact from your hand if you have both, from your graveyard to your hand if you have both. And that's a nice 2-for-1. Sanctum Gargoyle also likes the graveyard. It lets you return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. Sanctum Spirit lets you discard historic cards, which mostly means artifacts, to get indestructible until end of turn. So you can see how things sort of revolve around the graveyard here in a way. Artifacts in the graveyard are something you want to be doing in this deck. Rares for this deck, well, there's Tempered Steel, which makes your artifact creatures bigger. Salvage Titan, we've seen him before, an artifact that loves the graveyard. Geth, Lord of the Vault, a creature who can reanimate artifacts that are in the graveyard or creatures. And Leonin Abunis, which gives all your artifacts hexproof, which can be pretty scary if your artifacts are really powerful. So black-white is about recursion and getting artifacts in the graveyard and getting value out of them. It's sort of like the black-green deck was, except that deck doesn't care very much about artifacts and mostly cares about getting value out of creatures that are in the graveyard or being put into the graveyard. So our last color pair is blue-white, and it has a couple of things going on. It's another artifact deck, but it's also a control deck, and it's also about artifacts entering the battlefield. So it has some aspects of decks we've already seen. Our signposts here are Hannah, Ship's Navigator, another card that lets you return artifacts or enchantments, but mostly going to be artifacts here, from your graveyard to your hand. Glass Dust Hulk, which when an artifact enters the battlefield, it gets +1/+1 and becomes unblockable. You can also cycle it. And then there's Meddling Mage, which seems kind of out of left field. Doesn't care about artifacts, but it does kind of care about Into the Battlefield in the sense that you can change what you're naming with it if you blink it or something like that. But this is, like Blue-Red, I think a color pair that's more of a good stuff deck that has some synergies going on as opposed to a deck that's all about synergy. So let's look at the blue and white artifact payoffs together. You know, we've already seen the Salvagers, who get stuff from the graveyard. We've already seen Mersmith, which lets you create tokens. Remember the Fallen, which wants artifacts in the graveyard. Same with Sanctum Gargoyle and Sanctum Spirit, which can allow you to discard them. Then you also have Argivian Restoration and Fairy Machinist, Metallic Rebuke, Thirst for Knowledge, Riddlesmith, and then there are cards that help you abuse Into the Battlefield abilities of artifacts, like your Sanctum Gargoyle and your Machinist. We've got Esperzoa again and Sentinel of the Pearl Trident. We do replace Supernatural Stamina here with Flicker Wisp, but it does give you another way to blink things. So that's blue-white. So those are the color pairs for this format. This is a very artifact-heavy set. Some brief advice to give is that anything that says destroy target artifact is way better in this format than normal, so keep that in mind. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it, because that will help other people enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos about limited formats, draft videos of Double Masters, and Core Set 2021 as well, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want more limited content, you should see a playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.